Hi, this is Stephanie Lotvin of Tellybean Knits, and today I want to share a few of the tips and tricks that I have learned over the years while working stranded colorwork. This isn't going to be a stranded colorwork tutorial. Instead, I'm just going to share some of the things that help me get the best results with my stranded colorwork. And I'm not going to number them because I will certainly lose my way on which number comes next halfway through the video. So let's just get started. I'm going to start by telling you just the name of this sweater. This is the Boneyard Sweethearts Sweater. It's going to be coming out later in October, and I'm going to be demonstrating some of my suggestions for how to make your stranded colorwork more relaxing, more fun, and also how to get good results using the sleeve cuff of another sample of this sweater that I'm knitting right now. So to start, I'm going to just say up front that I think that the best way to be most successful in your stranded colorwork is to trust yourself. So if you have a method that you prefer over something that I'm suggesting, lean into it. Have confidence in it. If it works for you and you know that it has been working for you, there's absolutely no reason to change it. It's always fun to try something new, but if you hold your yarn differently than I do, or perhaps you have, a different method for carrying your floats, stick with it if it is the thing you love. I think that knitting should be something that you enjoy, and it should be something that you learn from, but not something that you force yourself to do any technique that is not comfortable for you. So my next tip is to use the same knitting needles that you do your gauge swatch with. And the reason I suggest this, I have a little sample that I'm going to show you. So this is a gauge swatch, or not a gauge swatch, sorry, this is a swatch that I actually worked for the stocking stuffer Cowl several years ago. I like to work these little swatches in the round whenever I'm trying to work out color combinations and when I'm trying to make sure that a motif is going to work, and I often make changes based on these little swatches. When I work these little swatches, I'm not working these swatches for gauge. The reason that I say that is because I learned something important when I was working this swatch, which is that I have a very different gauge when I'm working on a small circumference, when the length of my needle is quite short, than when I'm working on a needle that has a much longer length. So for example, I knit this little swatch using a 9-inch circular needle, but I worked the actual cowl using a 20-inch circular needle, and I got very different results, despite the fact that this was knit on a US size 4 and this was knit on a US size 4. My gauge was significantly different. This is something that I've learned over years of knitting stranded colorwork and working with different lengths of knitting needles. It can really affect the way that your gauge turns out. So because I hold my knitting needles quite differently when I use a shorter length knitting needle, it changes my gauge. And this is true, I think, for a lot of knitters have come across this if they're working, you'll maybe notice it when you're working the body of a sweater on a longer length knitting needle versus the sleeve of a sweater on a shorter length knitting needle. It can also be true if you have been swatching with wooden needles versus stainless steel needles. You'll hold your yarn, hold your needles a little differently, and because of that, it will affect your gauge. So I highly recommend, if you are working a gauge swatch, to use the same knitting needles that you're planning to use for your final knit. My next tip is don't assume that the gauge that you are getting in stockinette that is not stranded colorwork is going to be the same gauge that you get when working stranded colorwork. Many knitters find that they need to go up a needle size when working stranded colorwork, and I know some knitters that need to go up 2 sizes when working stranded colorwork. I'm actually unusual in that I knit stranded colorwork so much more loosely than I knit just a standard stockinette or other textured stitches that I actually have to go down a knitting needle size. This is really about experimentation, and I highly recommend swatching to make sure that's happening. Now, if you're working the Haunted House Mystery Knit Along or one of my cowls with stranded colorwork, the stranded colorwork that happens when you join in the round, it's not really critical that the gauge is exactly perfect. You can get away with small changes in gauge. If you're having large changes in gauge, this is going to affect how much yardage you have, and it is going to affect how the cowl ultimately fits. This tip is really important whenever you're working something where fit is really critical. So if you're working in a sweater, it's important to know if you're going to have a change in gauge from your standard stockinette to your stockinette stranded colorwork. My next tip is to always hold your yarn in the way that is most comfortable for you. I spent my first year working stranded colorwork being very self-conscious about the way that I held my yarn. I've been told that I knit in an unusual way, which I always think is a funny thing to say because I knit in a way that is perfectly comfortable for me. When I started working stranded colorwork, I got a lot of recommendations to change the way that I was holding my yarn. And while I think it is fantastic to experiment with different types of methods for holding your yarn, and I did try a lot of different methods, this method works best for me. I like to hold both my strands in one hand, and I insert my middle finger between those two strands. And so if you feel comfortable with your stranded colorwork hold, stick with it. If you want to experiment and try something new, I also fully support that, but don't feel pressure to make changes just because you think there's one way of doing things. That's the great thing about knitting, and the great thing about knitters is we all do it our own way. Let me show you a little bit of stranded knitting so I can give you a tip for making sure you keep your tension nice and loose, because that is the next tip. Keep things loose. With stranded colorwork, the key is to not let your knitting get too tight. It's always better to have loose stranded colorwork than it is to have tight stranded colorwork. And the reason that this is that you are carrying floats on the backside of your work. These links of yarn are worked on the backside of your work, and they're a way to carry the color from one portion of your chart or written instructions to the next. And you are going to want to have those floats be really loose so that when you block your sweater, your cowl, your hat, you don't have any puckering on the right side of your work. You want to be able to give all of those beautiful stitches room to really show what you're doing in your stranded colorwork motif. In order to do that, I recommend spreading out your stitches on your right hand needle as you work. So I like to use a knitting needle that gives me space to stretch those stitches out. If you have a lot of stitches on your knitting needle and they are always scrunched up because you don't have space to spread them out, you're just more likely to accidentally cause puckering. So as you're knitting, I like to every inch or so spread out the stitches on my right hand needle. When I spread those stitches out, it allows this float to remain loose. If I knit quickly, which is totally fine, slowly, however you like to pace yourself, and you keep these stitches scrunched up on your right hand needle, then you are more likely to have puckering, and you are not giving yourself a lot of extra space to allow your fabric to drape when you block it later. You want to be able to stretch those stitches out. So we're setting ourselves up for success by stretching those stitches as we work them. The other great thing about stretching out your stitches as you work them is that when you take that moment to stretch your stitches out on your right hand needle. It also gives you an opportunity to glance back at your knitting. That last inch or 2 inches, that you can give that a little look, verify that you are on the right path with your chart, or maybe you're working a pattern from memory, but giving your knitting a regular glance to make sure that the motif is coming together the way that you were hoping will save you some heartbreak later. Spread out those stitches, give them a little glance, and then move on with your stranded color work. It's always such a bummer to get 5 or 6 inches into a piece of stranded color work and look back and realize that you've made a mistake. So just a regular quick glance at your knitting will really prevent some of those troubles down the road. My next tip is to carry your floats no more than 1 inch. Now, I like to have a float that's nice and loose, and then when I carry that float, I don't like to carry that float for more than 1 inch. So in this circumstance, this pattern requires 5 stitches per inch. So I don't want to carry my new color in the back of my work for across more than 5 stitches. You can see here I have 2, 4, 5 stitches. If you're working on the Haunted House Mystery Knit Along Cowl, that stitch count for your gauge will be 6 stitches. So I would not recommend carrying your stranded colorwork floats more than 6 stitches. This will make your colorwork floats approximately 1 inch long at the maximum. Now, I will say, if you're working stranded colorwork on other projects, for example, whenever I work mittens, I often shorten the length that I recommend for carrying my floats, and I reduce that down to 1/2 inch, because whenever you're wearing a pair of mittens and you're putting your hands in them regularly, if you make these floats even shorter, you're less likely to put your fingers through the floats and pull at your colorwork when you insert your hand. So it does depend on the project that you're working on, but for sweaters, for hats, for cowls, I think carrying your floats no more than 1 inch works really well and really beautifully. The next thing I'm going to recommend when working your stranded color work is that you don't yank on your stitches when you work a new color. So I've just worked a white stitch in contrast with these gold stitches. When I move on to my next stitch, I don't want to pull on this stitch. By pulling on this stitch, I pull the float that it is connecting from the last color tight. And by pulling that tight, I'm reducing how much space I have later when I'm blocking, and I'm more likely to cause puckering in my work. So there's no need to yank on that stitch. Keep it nice and loose. Am I repeating myself yet? Keep it loose, nice and loose. No reason to let it get too tight. That's probably the best advice I can give you for stranded color work. I have a few more tips. My next tip is to always block your work. With stranded color work, blocking your work is really the key to having the best looking finished project. So I just want to show you an example. So this is an unblocked Boneyard Sweethearts DK hat, and this is the Boneyard Sweethearts Sweater. The sweater has been blocked, but the hat has not yet been blocked. And I feel really happy with how this hat turned out, but that being said, it needs a good blocking. My ghosts are looking a little wiggly. My skeletons are looking a little less clean and neat than I would like them to look. The stitches are just pulled in a little bit of a wonky way, but after blocking my stranded color work, I feel like things start to relax. It gives you a lot of room to improve the look of your knitting. You may feel while you're knitting your cowl, while you're knitting your sweater, that everything's just looking a little jumbled. maybe you're comparing yourself to other people and thinking, my color work is not as neat as some of the color work I have seen on Ravelry, on Instagram. And very likely what you've been looking at is a beautifully blocked finished object. If you haven't blocked your work yet, you haven't reached the maximum potential of your stranded color work. And when you block your work, especially when working with multiple colors, I like to use these color catchers. I got this box at Target. I also know that they're available on Amazon, and I have also seen them at Walmart. They are little, they look almost like a dryer sheet, except they're stiffer. They're sheets that come in this box, and these boxes last me absolutely forever. Whenever I block a sweater or something with self-striping yarn, anything that has multiple colors, I always put a color catcher in the water before I put in my knit. This color catcher will help to catch any of the loose dye that's in your water, and I almost never use an entire sheet, which is why they last so long. I really frequently just cut a small corner off and insert that in the water. For a larger sweater, I might use a quarter of a sheet, but these sheets are made to go into a washing machine tub and help catch lots of extra loose dye. And so for a single garment, it's just not necessary to use an entire sheet, but they are a really great tool because even the best and most incredible dyers, whenever you're working in stranded color work, will recommend to be very careful when you wet block your finished object. That is my final recommendation and tip for now. I hope that you are enjoying and you continue to enjoy your stranded colorwork projects. Thank you so much for watching.